Good everyone, welcome to this video. Today we have another episode of Should You Talisman, this time featuring the SB2U-2. So if you're new to this series, I normally tend to do a brief explanation anyway. If you're new to the series, this is a series where we're going to be looking at the vehicles featured in the Talisman series and covering them whether you should talisman them or not. This will not mean as in like you shouldn't do it because it's rank 1, it's not going to be that sort of series, otherwise we'd be here a long time saying that. This is just going to cover vehicles in good detail with the weaponry, the flight performance and the handling, and the competition that this vehicle faces compared to other vehicles in the respective tech tree. In the description below, you can skip ahead to any of these points should you wish to do so. English would be nice. And of course, if there's anything that you need to ask about the aircraft, or obviously tank once we start doing them, you are more than welcome to ask about it in the comments below should I not explain it here. Anyway, let's start out with the weaponry of the SB2U-2. The weaponry, of course, will include the secondary armament, as this is a dive bomber, and while fighters that we will be covering may or may not carry secondary payload, it obviously depends on the aircraft itself. But of course, with this being a dive bomber, this is something that does carry bomb load, and pretty much has to, because you cannot take it without any sort of weaponry and all that. So, let's cover the weaponry. So the forward firepower doesn't seem particularly amazing on paper. Twin 7.7 Browning machine guns. But the fact that you have over 1,000 rounds in each gun is actually quite impressive, and is very good for its aircraft, or the aircraft's overall farming ability. However, when it comes to engaging other aircraft, it is a bit lacking, and as a result, it is not amazing. But bear in mind, this does get different belts as opposed to the US Browning machine guns. This has the same belts as the British Browning machine guns. So that's just an important thing to note. These are not 7.62 caliber, these are 7.7 caliber, which are a bit different. But of course, these don't tend to pack a huge amount of punch, but of course they can set a lot of fires, as these belts tend to contain a lot of incendiary ammo. And as you can see there with Universal, we have a tracer round, an AP, an API, and an incendiary, which is of course very useful. The only other belt I'd recommend running is the tracers, as this has a huge amount of incendiary, as it is all incendiary. It's just the incendiary tracer bullet doesn't have much in the way of penetration, so you're not going to be getting too many fires out of those. It's mainly going to be the API doing the work. I would not recommend running stealth, because whilst it does have a huge amount of API content, and of course, the fact is that if you're new to the game, this isn't ideal, and of course, with only having 2 guns, it's not really worth running stealth on in any way, because obviously the lower caliber. As for the rear gun, it's exactly the same story. Obviously, it does have different belts, as it is a turret-based one, not a offensive gun. But of course, there are 3 belts to choose from. Obviously, default is terrible. AP shells, also known as armored targets, is pretty good, but it does lack in incendiary, as you can tell. Tracers can sometimes set fires, but they're few and far between. The belt you do want to run is the 7.7mm turret ammunition belt with API shells, also known as Universal. This has a tracer and has 3 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, which, whilst they won't pack a huge amount of punch against something like an armoured monoplane that you might run into, these are going to do work against biplanes and rather fragile monoplanes that you'll run into, such as the Japanese. But of course, this vehicle does have limited coverage with the rear gunner. It can go upwards to 90 degrees, and its horizontal traverse is 30. Well, its gun depression is 30. I don't know why I've read that wrong, but the horizontal, it can pretty much cover all of the axis of the aircraft, and it's more than adequate in that regard. And it won't do the hugest amount of damage, and obviously with this vehicle lacking any sort of armor, obviously it does have a bit here, but that's not going to stop anything. The rear gunner is probably going to have to come in clutch in some situations. As for bomb loads, the stock bomb load is 2 100-pound bombs and a single 500-pound bomb. Now, an important note is that the wing bombs do not have what's called a trapeze. This is what's called a bomb trapeze. It's very similar to what you had on like a Stuka, but of course this is a Vindicator, but it's the same concept. So these wing bombs drop at the same time, and this does mean that you're able to drop some bombs without having to wait for a slight delay. I believe the bomb trapeze on this is about 1 to 1.5 seconds, so you'll have to lead with 1.5 seconds taken into account. Now, if you're dive bombing a base, that's not a problem, because generally you'll be dive bombing a base anyway. But if you're attacking something like a tank, it's going to be quite hard to predict where they're going to go, and obviously with the delay, that will make your dive bombing a little bit tricky for Grand RB, so just bear that in mind. There are other payloads available, such as this naval mine, which is more than enough to kill a base at the respective BR. The 1,000 pounder can also as well, or if you want a good mix of everything, you can have the two 250 pound bombs and the 500 pounder in the center line. Of course, as I mentioned, the wing bombs will drop normally, this drops as a trapeze. The 1,000 pound bomb and the 1,000 pound naval mine, they also act on the trapeze, which you can see there, so just bear that in mind when it comes to that. Overall though, its bomb load and its weaponry isn't too bad. It's obviously got its flaws, because the 7.7s are not the most powerful, and of course having the trapeze might catch out newer players, but if you're base bombing, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. So, let's go to a test flight and take a look at the flight performance and the handling of this aircraft. See you in a moment. You now join me in the test flight. This is where we're going to go over, if you're obviously new to the series, the aircraft's handling, the overall performance of the aircraft, and just how it feels really to play. So obviously, as you can tell, even though we're not directly at sea level, because that would just be pointless because this thing is slow anyway, this aircraft is not very fast, and it won't be able to outrun anything other than the biplanes, and even some of the biplanes will keep up with this thing. And overall, its handling and its roll rate is not amazing, as you can tell there, but obviously this is a dive bomber, so don't expect it to be like a fighter. But of course, now I'm going to demonstrate what I meant about the trapeze, but if you skip the bomb set or the armament section, you'll see exactly what I mean. So I pressed obviously the naval mine is a bit bugged on ground targets, as you can see. I pressed the spacebar and then it took about a second for the trapeze to deploy and drop the mine. So yeah, it is a bit annoying in that regard. But the overall handling is not bad, but throw that in with the underpowered engine that this thing has, it doesn't tend to really handle itself too well. It can turn pretty okay, but as you can tell by the airspeed, it does bleed quite a bit of speed. And as the speed drops, the controllability drops even further, which is not exactly amazing. But even with like the bomb load removed, it is obviously going to be quite difficult to manage for a newer player. Now of course you do get a bomber spawn which helps with this, but it is not ideal. And just overall, the handling isn't amazing, the top speed isn't amazing, but obviously, as I said, this is a dive bomber, so do not expect it to be some sort of secret fighter. It can obviously handle itself in some regard, but that's few and far between. And as you'll see here with the rate of climb, look at the airspeed. Obviously, this is not the optimal climb angle for a Vindicator, so just bear that in mind. But this is not exactly amazing in terms of its climb, so make sure to keep your altitude when you do use your bomb load, well, when you're keeping your bomber spawn, that is. And it will do some work, but of course, if you're dive bombing a base straight away, you are going to feel this thing's performance, and it's not great. But as you can tell by the low speed turning and all that, it's not amazing. And when you throw on the bomb, which obviously this is set to reloads just to demonstrate, you wouldn't have a reload in RB. But overall, the handling of this plane and the rudder and everything just isn't amazing. You can capitalize on some vehicles, but I wouldn't say anything too high in this thing's regard. But anyway, let's go back to the hangar and discuss this thing's competition. I'll see you back in there in a moment. So now we're back in the hangar. As obviously discussed, we're obviously going to consider mainly the bombers for this, but of course the fighters have already. I'm going to mention as well, just because I really don't think you should talisman this thing, but even so. So as I said, the aircraft itself is well, it does have some metrics, but the problem is that there's something better, even if it doesn't change a huge amount in terms of its overall performance, and that's the SB2U-3. Whilst the engine does remain the same and the horsepower also remains the same, the forward firepower just tenfolds the SB2U-2, and the rear gunner even gets his own 50 cal, which can also do the exact same traverse angles. Whilst you do go up to 1.7, this thing can perfectly handle 2.7 matches just because it can be aggressive. And if it was down to me, this would probably be what I'd pick for a talisman other than the SBD Dauntless. The Dauntless takes that to 11 by obviously having the bombs, and it does have a trapeze, same as the Vindicators, but that's not why I play the Dauntless. If I'm ever in a bad mood, I take this bad boy out with gun pods, and well, yeah. The nose guns do run out of ammunition quickly, and you do trade the 50 cal from the SB2U-3, but just overall, I'd take that trade because the Dauntless has better handling, it has more horsepower generally, and just overall is a better aircraft to fly, and even has better dive brakes for one thing. As for other vehicles, the TBD Devastator would be quite a good option, because as I've mentioned before in previous episodes, this thing has much better handling, and whilst its speed is even lower, it just has much overall better handling and even comes with a front-mounted 50 cal, and that 50 cal can do some work. And unlike the SB2U and the SBD, this actually gets a bomb sight, which is also very useful for newer players, so that way you don't have to dive bomb, and really helps the TBD out in that regard. And of course, you should know this by now if you've been watching the previous episodes, but the F3, F2 is probably the best fighter you can pick at this BR, other than the P36A. And I'd say the F3F because of how agile it is. The P36A does have better performance. So, yeah. It's just really down to what you prefer. And obviously, the F3F can carry a couple of bombs, which is obviously going to be very interesting to cover. But the fact is that they're only 100-pounders, so if you do want a bomber, probably the TBD or the SBD is probably what I would suggest. And that comes us to the conclusion of the SB2U-2. Whilst it does have some metrics and obviously does have a bomber spawn, the fact is that the armament is just too weak to really make a huge difference at the BR it's at. Whilst it does have enough to take out biplanes and of course defend itself from biplanes, the fact is that it has no armor, and of course, well, it does, but it's literally just these cubes at the back here, which they don't even protect the rear gunner, bless him. But the fact is that this thing just doesn't have enough to really bring it to the table. And obviously, as I've said, the bombers that are around it and are just better than it. It's as simple as that. And even though that sounds like I'm just repeating myself with the pea shooters, it's point and true fact that the TBD and the SBDs are just better than this thing. But of course, the SB2U-3 turns that tide by having 450 cals in the wings and having a mid-wall belt 50 cal in the back. So overall, I wouldn't give this thing a talisman, but of course, this is pretty normal because if you watch the actual gameplay video of this thing in the talisman series, you kind of suggested, or you kind of knew that I'd say that anyway. So, next up in the series will be the OS2U-1 Kingfisher, which is of course a float plane, but this also isn't really going to be highly regarded, so don't expect it to be anything amazing. I will probably do a tank next though, so I will probably do the M2A4 next, just to give a bit more spice, but of course the next plane after that will be the OS2U-1. But anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it for today. I hope you've enjoyed today's Should You Talisman on the SB2U-2, and I will see you all on the next one.